Let us now talk about the world and how it has come back into sport. I am delighted to be joined by Katie McIntyre, who for the last 20 years has been one of the leading lights working across media and engagement, bringing together venue operators, hospitality partners, media, all of those people who are intrinsic to the ecosystem of the world of sports venues. Sports venues business is her business, and you are very welcome to Sport for Business. Katie McIntyre.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's so good to be here today, and it's been interesting listening, to all the panelists that have gone before me, especially Johnny Madil from Sheridan's. He had some really interesting insights in terms of risk and getting back to those full stadiums that we can't wait for.
I know risk is a frightening word, but we have to take it on and sure look at sport so we understand risk and rewards. We have been excluded from stadia and sidelines, and as I mentioned earlier, the pain of it has almost been sharpened by seeing crowds in Australia at rugby matches, at Wembley for football matches, for snooker indoors. The world is gathering around. From your vantage point, looking at this in terms of the venue operators, what has been the momentum over the last couple of months?
Obviously, it's quite timely that this conference has come this week because obviously, just sort of as you do your research, last weekend was huge in sporting terms. Obviously, when we look down to Australia, the AFL is very much back up and running. They actually had a post-COVID, I can't believe I'm saying those words, world record at the weekend. It was their traditional Anzac Day game at the Melbourne Cricket Ground. They had 78,113 fans back in the stadium, which is quite staggering numbers to say out loud, when you look at what position we're in here in Ireland. I suppose we have to look at terms of, they're doing it and they're getting back to it. I know before that the world record was I can't pronounce this, Ahmedabad, and they had 67,000 for the 2020 cricket last month. And then also this past weekend, Eden Park down in New Zealand had 50,000 for a concert, which is pretty staggering when you think that this was actually their first ever concert as well. So, not only to have their first ever concert, but for it to be to a sold out 50,000 capacity crowd in the middle of a pandemic was pretty good going. So I know I was talking to Nick Sortner, the chief exec of Eden Park Stadium, and he was telling me I think they needed 40% more staff than they would normally. I think they had 3,500 staff for the day. They needed more toilets. Obviously there was a lot more when it came to egress and ingress. There were so many things that now had to change, staggered entry times, negative test results, so much more to think about than we had before. And then obviously we've seen a whole host of pilot events going on globally. Obviously the UK and specifically England, because obviously Wales and Scotland have been running their own specific pilot events. But as we say, there was 8,000 at Wembley for the Carabao Cup last weekend. I know the Johan Cruyff Arena over in Amsterdam, they did a pilot event back in March with 5,000, and they actually had them in different, there was some that were socially distanced, some that weren't, some with masks, some without. I'm not sure what Johnny would have thought about that from a risk point of view, but that's, it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. Also then, sort of for the States, they obviously had a lot of events going on initially behind closed doors, and then now I think at this stage there's 14 states have reopened for all codes, with some level of spectators. There's only one stadium, as far as I know, which is actually reopened at 100% capacity. And that's the Texas Rangers brand new Globe Life Field. I'm sure some of you will have read some reports from the game at the weekend, so I'm not going to comment on any of that, but it's still an interesting point to make. And then obviously UFC, they moved operations over to Fight Island in Abu Dhabi. And so that they could run events. Before, obviously, then they were back at the ViStar Veterans Memorial Arena this past weekend. And instead of, obviously, normally I think the venue can host 15,000, but they had 2,000 for that event. And then also Barcelona, they had a 5,000 capacity event at the St. Geordie Arena. And the results that came out of that was that there was no significant impact on COVID spread. So I suppose, that's a very, I could go on, but I won't, because I'm mindful of the time. But, there's so many countries doing, so many codes. And it's like, I've never known before something that has brought everyone together. And I know, the previous speaker, Kevin Quinn from Leinster, and he was talking about their pilot. And how, they will make all of their key learnings and best practices available for everybody. And that's very much been something that, has been echoed throughout the codes, throughout the countries. Everyone's in this together, and everyone is sharing that data, which is great to see.
It is indeed. One of the challenges, I guess, is that you do find all of this data, all of this information. As you said, that was a brilliant whistle-stop tour of the world, and it could have taken in another dozen countries, another 24 venues. But it's the exceptions that will be the most important learnings from these. So, is that being shared? Is there some sort of a supranational way in which they can be shared, or if it's Barcelona Football Club, do they share with UEFA, who share with FIFA, who share with the IOC, and it gradually trickles down? Because things are moving so quickly that information and knowledge and evidence is of real value in the moment, as opposed to it being in a report which is published in January of next year.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange one. It's like there doesn't seem to be one sort of global, point where everyone can sort of report back their data. I know, like in the case of Johan Cruyff Arena, they're reporting their findings back to the Dutch government. And I know obviously that's the case with all like the pilot events going on, obviously in England, all that data goes back to DCMS. And then I know sort of, from a Premier League, and I know this is replicated across Bundesliga, La Liga, etc., that, any data is shared within that specific code. And I'm sure each government is providing some guidance and assistance. Obviously in the UK, they have the Sports Ground Safety Authority, who produce the Green Guide. And I know they have not only produced a document for English clubs, and that actually isn't just elite clubs, that goes through to, grassroots, leisure centres, everything. And they have produced an international document as well. But yeah, I think there needs to be a bit more joined up thinking. I don't know how we go about that, but it is something. Obviously, the media plays a role. Some might argue in a positive light, others not so much. But it is very much, it is only going to take one super spreader event to knock us back, months and months. So I think everyone is very aware of that. And I know obviously we've been talking this morning about, obviously the onus is on the club or the stadium. But, I think we also have to put some of the onus on the fans. If they want to come back into the stadiums, they're going to have to follow the rules. So, I think there's going to be a bit of give and take. But yeah, I think there's definitely an argument for, for there to be some overarching community that comes together and shares, throughout the codes, throughout the countries, and has one source point for all that data.
Okay, well, we'll build that between us this afternoon, and we'll let everybody know. It is obviously a challenge in terms of learning the best practices. One of the bigger challenges is the sheer diversity of different companies and initiatives that are being brought up to do testing. So if I want to put on an event and I want to do antigen testing and temperature testing and all of the other different elements that go alongside, I could literally find 24 providers of equipment. And I'm not sure which one of those is best, because it's all being developed, again, almost on a daily, hour by hour basis. Where is the gathering point for which ones of those will prove to be the ones that are the gold standard and which ones are slightly below that?
I mean, in America, they do have, sort of like a body that oversees and then reports back to all the different codes. I'm not sure we actually have anything like that in Europe. Like, I know obviously the Premier League, that they all share information and they will decide on, okay, X, Y, and Z, we're going to go with those. But it's still, I suppose, because it's a pandemic, and I'm pretty sure none of us were alive for the Spanish flu pandemic. So it is a learning curve for everybody, and unfortunately we're having to learn on the fly, so to speak. So it is very much a case of trial and error, and just finding out exactly what works. Like, I know, when we very first started looking at pilot events, there were the misting booths, there's the UV disinfection, I know there's the social distancing, many different types of technologies, there's the antigen testing. But I think over the time, as we've progressed, it seems to be that the items that are sticking out the most is that, when you run a test event, it's predominantly, you have to show up with a negative COVID test. B, you have to then socially distance if it's an indoor arena environment. And C, obviously, mask wearing. The US states don't always stick to that third one, but that's a whole other topic. But yeah, it seems to be those three: the negative test, the mask wearing, and the social distancing.
A large part the negative test is self-regulated. So I'm asked, do I have any symptoms, or have I been tested and it's negative? And I say yes, and yes to being tested negative, no to symptoms, and I'm therefore allowed to to carry on. So that question of putting it on the fans is obviously really important. the sort of, again, the duty of care on venues to provide the very best, the very tightest, without it going over the top. But we all, it's our responsibility to protect against those super spreaders. I'm a fan of the NFL, and I was watching some of the games that were taking place over in the US through November, December, and into January, and it was very mixed in terms of the social distancing, mixed in terms of whether they were open or not, but also in terms of the mask wearing. And there were some areas that you might think 80%, there were some that it was a lot less than 50%. I think we'd probably be better in Europe and a little bit more obedient in terms of it. But the obligation on the venue operator to make sure of this, you mentioned the additional crowd in Eden Park for the concert. Is there a universal pattern that's emerging about how public health funding can actually be used to soften the blow for venue operators who now will find it much more expensive to open the gates for an individual than they did 18 months ago?
Yeah, there's definitely going to be the case that more staff are going to be needed, and it's going to need very specific training. So there's a whole host of issues that we never had to think about before. It's like I was talking with Liverpool Football Club the other day, and their COVID manager. And, that is a new position that's come up the last 14 months. And yeah, there's so many things, like you mentioned there, sort of like turning up to an event with a negative test. Well, that then means that, you're relying on the fan to have followed the guidance and have self-isolated between having the test and then arriving at the venue. But that doesn't then take into account the fact they've actually had to travel from the venue. So I know, for instance, down at Eden Park, they actually use technology in a very clever way to sort of almost follow that entire fan journey, from home, whether they used public transport. I know a lot of public health guidance in that case specifically was, I know normally it's been, use public transport, but in this case, it was the opposite. It was, if you can, walk or cycle or use your own vehicle, because obviously you now need to think about the entire customer journey. It's not just, arriving at the stadium and, getting people into the stadium. It's actually getting people from home into the stadium and then safely back again. So that's where technologies like Liam Holton was saying earlier, future ticketing, actually following the entire fan journey to ensure that, if God forbid there is a super spreader event, at least you've got the robust track and trace in place to be able to identify and pinpoint exactly where, that's happened.
It's always been a golden ticket of sporting organizations and venue operators to own that journey. So to extend from having you or I in the stadium where we can be bombarded with all of the messages that are there, but as soon as we walk out, they lose us. And this could be an opportunity, given data reach and everything else, that we can actually make that journey much easier, so that from a fan's perspective, I can learn on the way up to the ground that, style O to M are actually quite busy at the moment, and you'd be better off going down to, P to R. And all of those kind of different little elements, which could improve the experience, because it's going to be different. We know that it's going to be different. In terms of the food and beverage, we mentioned that in relation to some of the events in England and here as well. Have you seen around the world where they've been a little bit more expansive in terms of allowing that?
Yeah, it's the whole sort of F&B offering has had to be, looked at, completely reimagined. Gone are the days when you could put out a tray of sandwiches, ham sandwiches, as we were talking about earlier. You know, but the caterers working with the venues have come up with, you know, sort of like ways to do that. I mean, obviously I'm talking, I suppose, predominantly more from the premium club level side of a venue. But, you know, I suppose, again, this is where technology is going to come to the fore. And, you know, we have to remember now, these are almost like an evolved beast of fan that's coming back to the stadium. They've had 14 months of using contactless, cashless, queueless, you know, everything has changed, and they're going to expect that when they come back to a venue. So, you know, that's where click and collect, QR codes, all of that are going to come into play. So, you know, you're still going to need admittedly, you might not need as many staff at, say, your concession point, but you can redeploy those to running, you know, to run then and take the F&B to like in-seat delivery, that type of thing. So, you know, we're going to have to evolve and look to other sectors, see what they're doing. And indeed, I suppose for us specifically from Ireland, it's going to be to look what other countries are doing, and what's working, and probably more importantly, what isn't.
I know St. Pauli in the German Football League have a little train that runs around the edge of their stadium delivering bratwurst and steins of beer and things like that. Maybe they were ahead of themselves. You mentioned contactless, cashless, queueless. Less, we want more. We want people coming back into the stadium. We want enough of the less, enough so that we can get more. But the you know, the optimism that our members expressed was not great, that we would be back in full. From your vantage point, where do you think that we will be back to 52,000 in the Aviva, 82,000 in Croke Park?
This is the $1 million question. It's, you know, and it seems to be different for different codes. Like, for instance, I was actually speaking to Matt Roberts, who's Director of Research and Analytics at Formula One a couple of weeks ago. And obviously he is, you know, as his title would suggest, very heavily involved in getting as much data and research as they can. You know, Formula One was actually one I should have mentioned at the beginning there. You know, they were a code or an entity that was able to very quickly change their offering. You know, to begin with, when they weren't allowed fans, they had the whole virtual series. And that actually opened them up to the whole Gen Z demographic, which they'd been very weak in before that. You know, so it was seeing that they sort of really, you know, evolved the offering. And I think that is, you know, going to be key for everybody when we're reopening. But like that, some of their data that came back, they asked their fans, you know, when they would feel safe about returning to F1 at full capacity, obviously when the situation allowed. And when they did the questionnaire last year, it came back at 50%, which is quite understandable. You know, we still didn't have the vaccine. We were still probably, I think we were in either lockdown 1 or 2 in the UK and Ireland when they did it, but they actually redid it at the start of this year, and it's now 70% of Formula One fans said, you know, they'd be more than happy to return. And interestingly, I know at the moment, as long as everything remains on course, Silverstone is due to be a full capacity event, and in actual fact, and I don't know if this didn't come from Matt Roberts, so don't take this as gospel, but I have heard that they're actually increasing the usual capacity. So I think it's normally 120,000 a day at Silverstone, and they're looking at increasing that to 140,000 per day at Silverstone. It'll be definitely interesting to see what kind of data comes out of, the AFL, the Eden Park, and then sort of what comes out, obviously. I know this is a very sore point, and I feel so sorry for Martin Murphy and everyone at Aviva Stadium that worked so hard in getting Aviva to be a Euro host. But it'll be interesting to see, what happens at Wembley, St. Petersburg, and all the other Johan Cruyff Arena, and all the other cities that do actually get to host the Euros this summer. But I think we have to be optimistic. What are we? We're on around 10% of the population vaccinated now. So I know the government is saying by the end of June, hopefully 80% of the population that wants to be vaccinated will be vaccinated. So, or will have had their first dose. So it'd be interesting to see what happens at 6 o'clock this evening when on Taoiseach, sort of hopefully provides us with our roadmap to reopening. But I think we have to look positive, but also bear in mind that, we need to evolve the offering. It has to be a very different experience, and if we open and there is a super spreader event, we're going to just be back at sort of square one. So it really is throw out the original rule book and start at the beginning.
Wouldn't it be great if we were able to have 140,000 at Silverstone? All of those of us who have become, who've fallen back in love with the sport through Drive to Survive. In Ireland now, we need to move from maybe P16 all the way through the field so that we're checking out getting to a podium finish. For the Aviva Stadium, for Croke Park, for Páirc Uí Chaoimh, for the RDS Arena, all of those arenas we want to. But it's been brilliant talking to you this morning, Katie. Thank you very much for your insight around the world. We'll do this again. And hopefully in person next time around, maybe even in a sporting stadium. Wouldn't that be great? But for the moment anyway, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you very much. From Sports Venue Business, Katie McIntyre.
Thanks so much, Rob.